Hello, this is Adam Chalom here. I've discovered that every time I've taught this class online and recorded it, we've always run out of time before we've had a chance to get to the discussion questions. So I thought I would create this separate video that explores the discussion questions related to our study of Haskala, Jewish Enlightenment, the Reform Movement, and Reconstructionist or Reconstructing Judaism, as it calls itself today, because I think there's some valuable ideas or information in there. Of course, I don't have a class with me to discuss them, so you'll have to put up with the conceit of my asking myself questions and then answering them myself. First, how was the Haskala successful? What were its shortcomings or failures? Well, most of us today live a Haskala-based life. Most Jews today live a Haskala-based life. We get a general education that's not limited to Jewish subjects. We speak a non-Jewish language in our daily life, not just in America, but in most of the diaspora Jewish experience in the modern period. We had a period of Yiddish speaking, obviously, that was before the Holocaust, where their mother language was the Mama Lashon, was Yiddish. But today, in the early 21st century, the vast majority of Jews outside of Israel, their first language is not a Jewish language. We have a lot of connections to non-Jewish culture, and we choose what television to watch or what music to listen to. We are not restricted to only Jewish content. We have substantially acculturated in our diet, our dress, our manners. I mean, you can tell by what I'm wearing or the fact that I shaved that this is a different world than the world of pre-modern Jewish life. We've also created new Jewish culture in new forms. If you look at all the TV shows and movies and limited series out there that are focused on Jewish topics or Jewish history or Jewish characters, we've created Jewish TikTok. I mean, we are not limited to only doing the old-fashioned ways and only doing it in traditional ways. Now, there are, of course, traditional Jews who look back to the past as their model, even today, who are cut off from the outside world. But even the fanaticism of the rejection of the outside world is a response to this new era of enlightenment and opportunity. And we who have more than one foot in that outside world certainly are living a post-Haskala life. The variety of different religious and cultural Judaisms that emerged out of the Haskala push to make changes is a celebration. I mean, is a wonderful achievement of what the Haskala promised, and also has created many more ways to be Jewish than existed before. And our approach is, as a pluralistic and supporting of pluralism organization, that the more options Jews have, the better things are. And most importantly, the Haskala achieved its major goal, which was to encourage Jews to connect with general human culture. And that's what we do today. We experience the world of human culture. Even if you look in December 31st, in the Jewish world, there are New Year's parties. And it's not the Jewish New Year, because we know the Jewish New Year is in the fall. But we also know what's going on in the world around us. Now, there have been downsides, too. There have been parts that Haskala has failed at. It did not solve anti-Semitism or Jewish persecution, but one of the goals was if Jews showed they could be enlightened and yet maintain Jewishness, they would cause the prejudice against Jews to evaporate and disappear. But of course, we know that didn't happen, most dramatically in Germany, which was the birthplace of the Haskala. We also know that the Haskala did not influence all corners of Jewish life. The ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews still ignore it or try to ignore it as best they can. So it did not hit everyone. That was a failure of its initial goals. We also know that it has not always been consistently applied among all Jews or varieties of Judaism. Some of them modify tradition without admitting it, or they think critically about history when it's other people's history, but they're not willing to think critically about Jewish history and apply the insights of reason and evidence to what actually happened in the Jewish past. So this is a case where Haskala was not perfect, of course, and it certainly had its shortcomings. Number two, what are the benefits of Jewish acculturation to the outside society, and what are some of the risks? Well, certainly, if we're integrated with our non-Jewish neighbors and our non-Jewish communities, that increases tolerance of, acceptance of, understanding of Jews, and it decreases prejudice against them. It's just like, if you're coming out as an LGBTQ individual, or you're coming out as a secular person, and the more people who know those kind of people, the more sympathy and the more empathy they might receive. The same is true for Jews. The more they were known by non-Jewish neighbors and non-Jewish business partners, a decrease in prejudice and an increase in tolerance and acceptance. And by the way, it went both ways. That is, Jews have become more tolerant and accepting of the non-Jewish world, the more non-Jewish people they get to know. The acculturation of Jews to the surrounding world also enables Jews to contribute to the surrounding society. Think of all those Jewish scientists, Jewish artists, Jewish writers, Jewish creators in all kinds of artistic media. They would have been limited to very limited Jewish forms and to a Jewish community if they had not experienced that openness to the outside world that encouraged them to participate in these broader cultural phenomena. And general society has benefited from Jewish contributions in those areas. Certainly, Jewish exposure to non-Jewish knowledge and science, we find a positive value that has brought us insight into the human condition. And so we are the better for having experienced the insights of people beyond our particular ethnic cultural community. We've even found that sometimes outside culture can improve Judaism. The great progress in the last 50 years in Jewish life towards gender egalitarianism between men and women, even the openness we have today to those who don't fit in that gender binary. All of that was a product of the general movement of feminism in American and European and Western society. It did not come natively from Jewish sources. There are certainly people who tied their feminism out on the street to their Judaism in the synagogue and at home and made changes in that direction. Jewish feminism is a really fascinating field of study, but it clearly is a reaction to being a feminist out there on the street and a feminist in your activism for women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendments and so on, and then coming back to the synagogue and being told to go behind the mechitza, the women's section barrier, or being told they can't be a rabbi, or they can't be the president of a community, or they can't even be the member of a community unless it's under their husband's name. I mean, these are changes in Jewish life that were wrought from the outside cultural phenomenon of feminism. And there are many other examples like that. Environmentalism is another one where we've learned from the outside world, and it has enriched our Jewish life and practice. And I guess most importantly, acculturation allows Jews to fully participate in their professions and in economic advancement. I mean, in the last decades or so, we've seen some progress from those who maintain an Orthodox lifestyle and yet are involved in broader culture and professional pursuits and so on. But for some people, the opportunity created by being part of the broader culture is something they would never give back, even for the comforts of a more traditional lifestyle. Now, as you may have guessed, I was on the debate team in college. We have to look at both sides of the issue. And there are certainly some risks to Jewish acculturation as well. I might say the benefits outweigh the risks, but we should acknowledge that there are downsides to this as well. Individuals might choose to become part of the dominant culture and to cease their Jewish self-identification. They'll say, I'm just a human being. Why bother with these Jewish roots? It doesn't matter to me anymore. We also find that the direct connection with historical Jewish practice and lifestyle is lost. And even if you reconnect with it, it's a different dynamic if you're readopting kosher practice in your diet than if it's something you carried through all the way, generation to generation, grandparents to parents to child, and so on. It's a very different dynamic to readopt it. In fact, it can cause family tension, where if the parents don't keep kosher and their child decides they do want to keep kosher, now that child's kids can't eat at their grandparents' house because of the family choices. So it gets tricky as you get that distance from traditional Jewish practice. I'm not endorsing or unendorsing that traditional practice. I'm just saying it's a different dynamic, and there is some disconnection from that direct inheritance model. We do know that as many Jews have acculturated, those who are visibly Jewish, who wear yarmulkes or traditional Jewish dress, sometimes face particular challenges, even explicit discrimination, anti-Semitism, and sometimes violence, because they are identifiably Jewish, where those of us who dress like everybody else are not immediately identifiable by our ethnic and cultural background. Acculturated Jews look mostly like everybody else, and thus they are less visible to the broader world. They're also less visible to the Jewish community as well. If you ask American Jews what proportion of American Jews are Orthodox, you might get much higher numbers than the actual 10 to 15% that demographic studies have shown, because, of course, Jews who aren't Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox dress, act, eat like everybody else. And that's a challenge for the acculturation process. You're simply less visible to the outside world, yes, but also to Jews themselves. Third question goes back to that 1885 Pittsburgh Platform of Reform Judaism. There are a number of elements that do sound close to secular and humanistic Judaism, but there are some others that are somewhat inconsistent with our approach. For example, the desire to have a consistency between Jewish practice and modern life. They said things that are not adapted to the habits of modern civilization we leave behind? Well, we want to adapt our Judaism to fit with our modern values and lifestyle practices. We're open to changing the modern things too, but we're willing to change Jewish practice to fit how we already live. Certainly, when they say the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age, we might not be as dismissive and use the word primitive, but it certainly reflects an earlier age, and we think in many ways we've gone beyond that in terms of sexual orientation inclusion, lifestyle choices, treatment of non-Jews, treatment of children, treatment of women. Okay, so there's a number of areas where we have a lot of difference in their approach to values and approach to society. And so we're willing to make that distinction. And the fact that the Reform movement did so as well, we see an affinity or a parallel to us. Certainly doubting supernatural miracles, that's something that we would definitely agree with. Their emphasis on the importance of human action, one of the parts we didn't have a chance to read in our class was emphasizing how people have a responsibility to make the world better. Well, we absolutely agree with that. The fact that they had a universalist approach, that they were interested in the benefits to humanity of what Jews could do, and the insights of humanity and the value of being part of a broader, diverse society. We value all those things as well. And most importantly, the fact that the Reform movement changed Jewish ritual practice, both in terms of private behavior and in terms of what's happening in the synagogue. They were the pioneers in saying, if we don't believe it, we're not going to say it. And so that was part of the initiative of Reform at its earliest steps, was to change what we didn't believe based on modern values and beliefs. Now, where do we diverge from this 1885 Pittsburgh platform? Well, very obviously, the platform says that Judaism is a religion. We are not a nation, we are just a religious community. And they emphatically said they are not an ethnic group, where secular and humanistic Judaism accepts Judaism as a cultural ethnic group, or we can call it an open ethnic group because you can join it. We accept people who convert or are adopted into our Jewish family. Nevertheless, the idea that it's only a religion when most people don't believe what the religion tells you to believe, and most people don't follow the ritual practices and recite the blessings or attend a synagogue or are members of a synagogue. I mean, it just seems odd to call it primarily or exclusively a religious definition based on people's behavior. So we would disagree with that plank of the platform. The first 2 points in that platform are very God-focused. Even if they talk about a God idea, they still have a supernatural, infinite being that they're referring to, and we tend to focus more on the human and the natural. They do occasionally impose ritual choices. They say these things are foreign, entirely foreign to our mental state, where we might say, it's up to you to make choices of what's meaningful to you. And actually, the 1999 platform does talk about an individual standard for what's meaningful in ritual practice, and that one we would agree with. And they do claim that the Bible is the most potent tool for moral instruction, and that the Jews preserve the best version of the God. There's still a bit of chosenness in there, and we're not necessarily convinced the Bible is the best tool for moral instruction. Now, the next question talks about the differences between the Reform movement's 1885 platform and its 1999 platform. I touched on it briefly during the main class, but I would encourage you to go back, look up those statements, and take a look. There are some very interesting changes in that, although it's really more about the Reform movement than about secular humanistic Judaism. Now, thinking about the Reconstructionist movement and their approach to Judaism as a civilization, what might be some of the strengths or the challenges of treating Judaism as a civilization rather than a religion? Well, obviously, since we do this, we see more strengths than weaknesses, but we'll look at both sides. If you're focusing on the strengths, there's a broader range of ways to connect to Jewish life. It can be religious history and literature, but it can also be food and language and history and art and music. Those are all part of a civilization. It doesn't only have to be religious ideas and studying books. The emphasis on people's experience and cultural creativity is one that we value, because it's not just what the rabbis said, but what people actually did and the choices they made. The fact that it evolves over time. Civilizations and cultures change over time. They respond to surrounding cultures. They are different from one generation to the next because they're inherited by a new generation and new circumstances that needs to change it. And so accepting that as the basis, rather than a religion given on a mountain that has to say the same, but an evolving civilization created by people over time in response to new circumstances, that fits much better with our understanding and with what's meaningful to us. if you talk about Judaism as a civilization, there's a lot of theological perspectives that are possible within the range of what a culture or civilization includes. And that, again, more accurately reflects our values of pluralism and individual freedom of thought. So those are some of the strengths of that civilization approach. There are some downsides too. After all, the religious outlook, beliefs, and practices certainly influenced, if not defined, the limits of cultural expression for most of Jewish history. That is, you couldn't have created a Jewish sculpture celebrating bacon in the 1500s. You can do it today, and it has a kind of ironic Purim, mock things kind of sensibility to it. But you couldn't have gotten away with that, both the idolatry and the fact that Jews were moving a lot, so the portability and the content of doing it about bacon. That wouldn't have been acceptable in those circumstances. So religion did have an oversized impact on how the civilization was expressed and how it was created and how it evolved. Secondly, most people today think of Judaism as one of the big three religions. There's Judaism, there's Christianity, and there's Islam. Of course, Islam is a multi-ethnic global religion of 1 billion people. Christianity is a multi-ethnic global religion of 1 billion people. And Judaism has sub-ethnicities, but there's always a sense that being Jewish is both religious community and separate ethnic group and a separate existence, even if Jews between parts of the Jewish world look very different from each other. There's still a sense that being Jewish is both a people and a religion. And after all, there's only about 15 or 16 million of us compared to the billion of either Jews or Muslims. We like the status of being one of the big three religions, but in actual practice, how people live and how they have lived, the civilization idea might be more accurate. And finally, most Jewish communal celebrations today are primarily focused around religious holidays or holidays that people assume are religious. Of course, if you think of it as culture, then religion is part of culture, but culture is broader than just religion. And it wasn't based on historical events as much as the imagined history of the Bible or the religious ritual celebrations. You do have Hanukkah, which is based on a historical phenomenon. And in modern Jewish life, we have Israel Independence Day, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. These are based on real historical events. But if you're talking about the sort of cultural calendar that Jews celebrate in their homes, we don't have a home celebration for Israel Independence Day. And that isn't something that's been developed in the intervening decades. And finally, the larger picture question with which we started the class is it legitimate for secular humanistic Judaism to claim its roots in other still existent branches of religious Judaism? Well, you might say it's legitimate because we have a shared ancestor. Biological evolution has ancestors that are very different from later versions, and branches can diverge from those common ancestors. And sometimes the common ancestors are still around in some form, or some version that's closer to those ancestors than something that branched off from it. We should also recall that other movements can be an historical source of ideas and practices that secular and humanistic Jews follow. So we might not have been part of the reinvention of the Tu B'Shvat Seder in the 1980s and 90s as Jews became more environmentally focused and made it a Jewish Earth Day version. It wasn't part of my experience growing up at a humanistic synagogue in the 1980s. But whether we learned it from Jewish renewal or the Reform movement or simply the ethos of Jewish life at the time, it is part of the calendar of humanistic Jewish communities today. And we don't have to reject it simply because it came from outside of our movement. We don't have to make everything ourselves. We don't live in a bubble, just as no Jew has ever lived in a bubble. We also point out that many Jewish movements, even going back centuries, have been influenced by ideas from beyond their own movement, from Jews and from non-Jews. And so expecting your genealogy, or your intellectual genealogy as a movement to be a straight line like this, as opposed to all these strands coming together from all over the place, it's not realistic. It's not how things actually develop. Now, it should be said very clearly that Reform Judaism does not endorse secular humanistic Judaism. It does accept it as part of the Jewish spectrum. There are, for example, decisions that accept our converts as converts to Judaism, our rabbis as legitimate rabbis in the spectrum of rabbinic education and training that's out there. But when a humanistic congregation tried to apply in the 1990s to join what was then the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the Union for Reform Judaism, they were strongly rejected, overwhelming numbers, because it was not the understanding then, and as articulated in the decision, that a humanistic congregation was not a Reform congregation. So we wouldn't want to lend an implication that the Reform movement endorses us as part of Reform Judaism. That's not their approach at all. Same thing for Reconstructionism. We see ourselves as different movements. We have to be careful not to selectively quote just the parts of the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform we like and then say, look, they endorse us. That can obscure the intent of the original authors. They did have a God concept that was an important part of their liturgy and practice. They did define themselves as a religion. We also don't want to minimize the difference between denominations, where we live in what people sometimes call a post-denominational world today, where the lines are getting fuzzy between the two. But sometimes there are significant differences between them, and it's okay for there to be differences. You go to different kinds of restaurants, you experience different kinds of culture, and if you're going for a classical music concert, it doesn't have to turn into a ska band concert or a reggae concert, right? Those are very different genres of music, and they're allowed to be different. You might have crossover events occasionally, but you're also welcome and encouraged to have reasonable expectations based on the labeling of what you're going to get when you go to a particular concert. In some cases, our break with elements of traditional Jewish life are unique. Our style and the format, the language we use for our liturgy is different. And it's important to maintain that difference, to have a clear identity, and also to clearly reflect your particular philosophic perspective on what language means and why we include it in certain ways, what we believe about the universe and humanity's role in it, and how we explain who we are. So having that divergence in liturgical practice also makes sense to keep those differences with other denominations. And to be honest, it'd be somewhat arrogant to claim that secular humanistic Judaism is the pinnacle, the telos, the ultimate goal of all Jewish liberal religious evolution. And as if all the others are backwards and they stopped at the wrong point, they didn't go far enough. Well, that's not realistic either. If you think about the diversity of Jewish life today as if it were different flavors of bagel, who's to say which flavor is better than the other or which one is more legitimate than the other? I might think Asiago cheese is an abomination, but you might think that a blueberry bagel is an abomination, and I've learned that blueberry bagels can be just fine. So you'll have to choose which flavor of bagel, which flavor of Judaism is more meaningful to you, and there is no better or worse, right or wrong, legitimate or illegitimate in a world of pluralistic Jewish choice. Well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration of these discussion questions. We'll be picking up at our next session with our next source of roots. But hopefully this wasn't too much listening to me talk the whole time, and you at least had a chance to think about how you might have answered these questions if you'd been part of the discussion.